My name's Kylie Hansen and I'm a Senior Consultant at WACOS. And before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Acknowledging though, as a webinar, some of you might be joining from other countries. So just want to extend that respect to all elders past and present, and acknowledge that the land that we are meeting on was never ceded and is and always will be Aboriginal land. Sorry, it's hard to manage the waiting room at the same time as speaking. So WACOS Wednesdays at 1 is what we're hoping will be an ongoing series, potentially not weekly, but an ongoing series about issues and key topics facing the community services sector in WA. So in this series, we're inviting some engagement and from our members around a series of presentations that we are putting on with some of our key sector and government partners. And this first series has really also focused a lot on the recovery thinking and what it looks like to make sure that we have an inclusive plan for recovery, to make sure that we don't leave any Western Australians behind. In terms of Zoom etiquette, if you can remain on mute, that's awesome. I think everyone's pretty practiced at that by now. But if you're able to have your video on, it's lovely to see you. So totally up to you. Whilst people are speaking, we encourage you to use presenter view because that'll just have the presenter front and center for you. So presenter view is up in the top right hand corner of Zoom, or speaker view, I think it might also be called. And please do be ready to participate in the small group conversations at the end. We get some feedback that that's one of the most useful and important parts for people. So if you're able to participate in that, hopefully you've got a microphone working, that would be great. So for this session on digital inclusion, we're joined by Chris Toomey from WACOS, Professor Alan Duncan, who's the Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre, and John Dixon and Ashley Pruitt from the Office of Digital Government in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. So Chris will make some opening remarks from a WACOS perspective, followed by Alan, who will speak to some of the important work that the BCEC has been doing in the area of digital inclusion, followed by John and Ashley speaking to the state's digital inclusion blueprint. So much talk about recovery lately that I get confused. So we'll kick it off because we've got a pretty packed agenda. So I'm going to pass over to Chris in the first instance.
Kaya, nalakadich nungamot, kayang hadak nichibucha. So what I want to talk to just briefly in introducing the discussion today is particularly why is digital inclusion important to community services and the communities and individuals they support, particularly those who are disadvantaged or excluded. So usually when we're talking about digital inclusion, the key focus is really all about access. So there's issues around physical infrastructure, that's particularly around in the regions, and we've seen increased demand on bandwidth with COVID, more people working from home. But it's also then about affordability and accessibility issues. So affordability and the impacts on people in lower income households, and depending on where you are, what the cost of access to technology is. But then also accessibility issues, which can be around vision and hearing impairment, but it can also be about digital literacy, your comprehension, your ability to navigate digital spaces. So there's issues there for people with cognitive impairment, there's issues there for seniors. Then increasingly the access issues are also more about access to public services online. And so one of the concerns for us in the community sector is there a risk that those in the greatest need could be facing the greatest barriers? And you know, one of the big concerns we've heard from a lot of frontline organisations, we hear this from local government, we particularly hear this from community resource centres, is that they're spending a lot of time helping people to access government services like Centrelink online. And so there's some pros and cons about online services. For some, it can increase access and ease, but for others, it can create barriers. And for some services, they need to be face-to-face. And for some types of things, they can work well when you've already got an established relationship. And the other thing in the digital access space is really about digital safety, because kids these days are particularly increasingly growing up online, and we need to make sure spaces are safe. But the other thing I wanted to mention today is inclusion is not just about how we can access information, services and places online. It's also about what we can access. So we can have the world's best digital infrastructure, but it actually doesn't help if the things that you've got perfect access to are online casinos, targeted marketing, scams and porn, and you don't have access to services or places that are about building community. So I guess one of our concerns is that public digital infrastructure and planning should also be about creating safe and empowered places online and talking about how we're actually building community. And so this is this concept of digital citizenship, which is really about what are we doing that supports and enhances public participation. And there's some incredible opportunities that digital technologies can offer us in public consultation, engagement, involvement in decision making. And we've seen some of our larger and more progressive local government areas have really embraced this, but there is a risk that smaller and regional ones can be missing out. There's also a concern there that social media have become particularly important for many in our community, particularly younger people and those who are more physically and socially isolated. And COVID has kind of highlighted this as well. But then there's also a risk if the only social media spaces we have are those who are controlled by vast corporate interests who can shape what we see to make their own commercial or political ends. So I guess to conclude there, if we want a level digital playing field, then it's not simply about individual access issues, which are critical, but it's also about community access, about creating community places where people can meet, debate, organise and create shared value. So we need a digital community development agenda as well as a digital access one. What I'd like to do now is introduce Professor Alan Duncan. Alan's the director of the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, and he's one of Australia's leading economists. In fact, he ranks in the top 5% worldwide. Alan's work takes a strong focus on social issues and outcomes, and it's really about actively engaging in public debates and driving them with rigorous evidence-based research and a focus on creating better and fairer outcomes. Alan was formerly the director of NatSem at the University of Canberra, also previously the head of school and professor of economics at Nottingham School of Economics in the UK. Alan's now going to give us some reflections on a recent EC report on the digital divide, some of their small business survey work and work on poverty, as well as some of the more recent work they've done on the impacts of COVID and how it relates to digital inclusion. So I'll hand over now to Alan.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you all for the opportunity. I should stop sharing so I could speak to you directly before I go on to my slideshow. Hi. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to take you through what we regard as quite important work in the context of the digital divide and the necessity to extend digital access to all, especially as we're developing far more a stronger online culture, that services are being increasingly delivered online, and that a lot of social interaction, as Chris says, has become online for many, and especially those that are in physically isolated areas. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just taking you through some key findings that I think speak very much to the brief on digital inclusion, which is the topic of this webinar. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on. I'm speaking to you from lands of the Whadjuk people of Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So let me again endeavour to share my screen. Here we go. Is that looking good for everybody? Excellent. So, I wanted to start by taking you through some of the key conclusions from Falling Through the Net report. This was a report that was released in 2017 by the BCEC, and it really does speak to a range of the issues that we're discussing at the moment. The organising framework for the report is around accessibility and affordability, and in these for us, are really important themes in in seeking to develop both the infrastructure and the capacity to be able to drive that infrastructure in WA. So let me just start with some basic issues of access and just road test how WA stands relative to other jurisdictions. These are data that are taken from the Australian census, and they effectively count the share of individuals who have access to internet by state in the 3 censuses, most recent censuses, 2006, 11 and 16. As you can see, there's been a consistent progression of access to internet from somewhere around 70 to 80% in most state jurisdictions in 2006 to beyond.
I don't know that we're looking at the same slide you are.
Beg your pardon?
I'm not sure that we are on the same slide as you are.
Okay, thank you for that.
No,
what slide are you looking at?
Organising framework.
Ah, okay, that's interesting. So your slide hasn't progressed in the same way that mine has. Okay, so have you moved to households apart access?
Yep.
Excellent. Now we're in good shape.
Yes, excellent.
Thank you for that. Thanks for interrupting. Good. So internet access has progressed, strongly over the last 10 years, the last decade, according to the 3 latest censuses, as you can see here. And indeed, WA overall ranks 2nd behind ACT in the share of those households that do gain access to internet. So that at a broad level is a good news story. However, really importantly, and this is what we tend to do a lot in BCC's reports, very important to dig down into the data to see where there are gaps, where there are separations in the level of access according to particular circumstances or demographics. Here, for example, you see a chart that evaluates the share of those in different age categories that access internet. Very evidently an age gradient here, whereby in WA on visa data that are drawn from the Survey of Income and Housing, the latest available at the time of the report. And you can see that for WA, whilst the young people are almost universally accessing internet, progressively as the cohorts age, you can see that access reduces, and indeed for those 65 and over in WA, around 61% of people are accessing internet. So that's an important gradient to be aware of, especially given the fact that access to services, especially to the elderly, if we're considering that to go online, then this is clearly an important consideration. Of course, remoteness is an absolutely critical element in access. This represents the share of people with access to internet by level of remoteness from major cities through to the very remote areas. And to be honest, WA does better than most other jurisdictions in reaching remote areas, but it is still the case that around 17% of people in the remotest areas of our state do not have access to some form of internet. And I think one of the most important gradients that we picked in this report is the socioeconomic gradient. If you look at the level of access by income and you divide the population into 5 equal shares according to their level of income, the lowest or poorest 1/5 of society, you can see here that across each state, the levels of access to internet range between around 62.5% in South Australia to just under 3/4 in Western Australia. Now, as you progressively increase the level of income, you can see that access also progresses to virtual universality. It is therefore extremely clear that there is a socioeconomic gradient that we need to be aware of when considering the degree of access to internet and online services. Just to drive home that point, this is a map that looks at internet access by small area in Western Australia, by SA2 region. And you can see that there's a massive gradient here, especially to do with remoteness and to do with socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage. The most disadvantaged area in terms of internet access is in East Pilbara, where beyond half of the population of that area state that they have no access to internet. This is an area with around a fifth of the population being Indigenous, and of course it is an extremely remote area. So these rank as the top 20 areas where with the least access to internet services. Interestingly, there are some, for example, Mandurah there that just creeps in. I've snuck this in at position 21. Clearly not a remote area, but still an area where, with a very low CIFA, there do still seem to be problems in certain groups within that local community being able to access internet. And of course, the divide extends not just to access, but to the sorts of services that individuals are then able to access online. This chart looks to itemize what people use the internet for, what sort of services are accessed online, and the share of, in this case, Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations that are gaining access to these different types of services. Some of the gradients and the divides are really pronounced. For example, in the lodgement of bill payments, nearly 80% of the non-Indigenous population use online services to lodge bill payments, but amongst the Indigenous population, it's purely half of that. Similar separations occur around the lodgement of tax returns, where it's basically it's again, you know, half the rate of access between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous communities. Healthcare, again, really quite concerning. More than a fifth of the non-Indigenous population access health services online, whereas only 7.7% of the Indigenous population do. If we then drill down further to try and itemize those that profess difficulty in accessing different online services by type of service, again, we see this sort of separation and there's the relative challenge that the Indigenous populations do face, often by virtue of remoteness, but potentially also by demographic or socioeconomic status. Centrelink, around 38 to 39% of people face difficulties in accessing Centrelink services. Not much of a divide between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population, but importantly, I think in relation to health services, doctors or dentists or hospitals, a greater share of the Indigenous population profess to having difficulties in accessing those types of online services, and housing as well. There's a marked separation there. I should say that this chart actually comes from a recent COVID-19 brief that BCC released that focused on the issue of social connectedness and loneliness in an era of COVID-19. What are the barriers to access? Again, I think there are some really important divides here to take note of. What we did is by using sample survey data, we differentiated households in surveys according to whether or not they had children under 15. And then we evaluated those that state that the barriers to internet access are of different forms, either cost, not having a need, lack of confidence or knowledge, or privacy and security. For those with children under 15 years of age, clearly cost is an important component. Nearly half of those that faced a barrier to internet access stated that cost was an issue. For those that didn't, without children under 15, by far the most prevalent reason for not accessing internet is because they profess to have no need, but more than a fifth, 22.2% of those without children under 15 state that their barriers to internet access are through a lack of confidence or knowledge, a lack of capacity or ability, if you like, to use the online service that's available there. Okay, I want to touch on affordability before very quickly moving, I think, to some important concerns around the small business community. I'm sorry, I'm slightly overrunning, but I hope to get through these quite quickly. I'm sorry, Kathy. price of digital services has actually fallen per unit of quality quite consistently over the last 2 decades. This represents Perth's headline CPI, and this schedule represents the subset CPI for telecommunication services in Perth. There's been a decline over, possibly the last half decade in telecom services. BCEC produced a more augmented index of digital CPI, which incorporated also AV and audio and computer services alongside telecom services. And when we look at that index, we can see that there's a systematic decline in price per unit quality. So this is where we bundle 2 published price indices together to produce one. And I think that's an important, quite smooth gradient of a declining cost per unit of quality, per quantum of service. And so you would think that that would alleviate cost pressures, but of course it doesn't. Because in actual fact, as we progress with each successive year, digital access becomes far, far more of an essential element, and people are accessing more bandwidth, they're accessing greater capability and require greater competence in accessing digital services. What we actually find in looking at the data is, number one, people are spending a greater share of their income on digital services, and number two, that the share of income that people commit towards digital services is greater for lower income earners. And what that actually means is that digital is becoming ever more a necessity of life. It is not a luxury, it's not a discretionary item, it has become a necessity. And that, I think, is a really important element to consider when it comes to setting digital policy. And actually, when you look at the spread, the spread in the share of digital spending by different levels of income, those with the lowest fifth of household incomes typically, or on average, would spend around 3.5% to 4% of total spending towards digital. But that doesn't mean that for some there are elements of stress. Around a quarter of people in the lowest income category spend more than 6.5% of their income on digital. And around 1/10 of those in the lowest income quintile spend more than 1/10 of their income, their total expenditure, more than 1/10 of total expenditure is on digital access. So there's potential for some to fall into what we call digital stress. We actually take that a little bit further and evaluate the proportion of people who do suffer from some form of digital stress, where we categorize digital stress to be those who are in the lowest 2 quintiles of income and who expend more than 10% of that income on digital services. And when we look at that categorization of, or look at the prevalence of digital stress, we find that more than 10% of single parents with children face some form of digital stress. That is rising. And non-elderly single men and women, we see a rising propensity towards digital stress with around or just over 10% of households in those categories, facing that sort of stressor. And then further, if you take, for example, families with children, and you look at the propensity for families with different numbers of children to face this characterization of digital stress, you can see that there's a massive gradient. Single parents with 3 or more children, around 1 in 6 of those single parents are spending at least 10% of their income on digital services. And of course that makes sense because, as Chris pointed out earlier, the digital access is an absolute imperative, particularly for the younger cohorts in our community. And hence necessarily families with large numbers of children will feel that burden to provide that sort of access, and hence commit a greater degree of spend to the service. 2 or 3 slides to look at the small business large divide section of our report, and then I can stop talking. Internet access by business size has, as with personal access, been growing consistently over time, even amongst the small and micro businesses in our society. But small and micro businesses have taken longer to gain access than the larger business sizes. but at the moment we're sitting at around 94% of small or micro enterprises between 0 and 4 people employed having access to internet. For the majority of industry sectors, access to internet is now pretty much universal. But for a couple of sectors, there's a lag. This slide shows the shares of of businesses overall across different industry sectors, and the first lagging sector here is agriculture, forestry, and fishing. You can see that systematically the share of businesses in that industry with internet access is below the predominance across most other businesses. Even more pronounced were the shares of businesses in the accommodation and food services sector with access to internet. Until 2012-13, less than 3/4 of businesses in those sectors had access and used internet services as part of their business. Interestingly, that jump in 2012-13 coincided with the launch of Airbnb in Australia. If you also take account of when Uber Eats launched in Australia in 2015-16, there's a little bit of a bump there in the accommodation and food services sector, which I think also is at least something to track. So clearly, internet is becoming prospectively more and more of a benefit and a necessity for small businesses. However, in a survey that BCC conducted in 2017 of the small business sector across regions of WA, and a survey that we will be repeating in 2020, we find that the quality of internet infrastructure, self-reported quality of internet infrastructure amongst small businesses, was not particularly great for around a quarter of businesses in most regional areas of Perth, and in Gascoyne by around 30.8% of businesses. And in terms of which small businesses in different sectors of the economy, we find that the poorest internet and mobile phone infrastructure faced by businesses were principally in agriculture, forestry and fishing, in electricity and water and waste services, in education, training, and in manufacturing. So again, there's a bit of a divide there according to which industry you're working in. Again, clearly demographics have, so your regional location has a big part to play there, and your remoteness, the level of remoteness that you face. Last couple of slides. What have businesses been using internet for? Really important to understand whether or not the capabilities are being developed to capitalize on internet access that's made available. For the smaller businesses, internet and IT is principally used for very functional measures of accounting, invoicing, and human resources, but very little in terms of processes. Proportionately, far fewer small businesses use the internet for marketing and capitalizing on opportunities to develop sales and to grow. In contrast to the larger businesses of 20 plus, for whom marketing is a far more important component of IT and online access. So it strikes us that, especially in the spirit of COVID, there is perhaps a bit of a deficiency in the sort of capabilities that smaller businesses in particular are bringing to bear in their online presence. One thing that we've noticed substantially, and I'll stop sharing now, one thing that we've noticed substantially in analyzing small businesses' responses to COVID is that they've been developing more and more an online presence. However, that presence is there and available, but not necessarily being capitalized on, with small businesses being less familiar with the sorts of processes that online presence can deliver, accessing export opportunities, accessing sales and promoting and marketing services. It seems to us that COVID has created an opportunity in the small business sector, especially in the regions, with people building more of an online presence, but where that is now a piece of infrastructure, an asset to capitalize on. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for your tolerance and time.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was really fascinating stuff, and there's quite a lot to get through there. Does anyone have any questions for Alan? If I can't see you raising your hand, you can take yourself off mute and ask. Otherwise, we can move on. Great. Okay, and there'll be more opportunities for questions later. So thanks again, Alan. I think it was a really great overview across a whole bunch of different sectors and areas that are of interest to people on the call. So I'll now hand over to John and Ashley from the Office of Digital Government, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, to talk us through the blueprint. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Kylie, and thank everybody for joining today and for this opportunity for us to share with you our digital inclusion blueprint. I'm just pulling it up, so hopefully the slide deck's coming up. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where I'm joining today, or Ash and I are joining from, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and we too pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today we just want to spend a quick, a lot of the information that we've heard is totally relevant for the way that we're shaping up the digital inclusion blueprint. So there's no contentious issues that we're really hearing. It's we're all on the same boat, and I think that we're just slicing it from a slightly different lens from where our interest is. But what I'd like to do, just in a quick, we'll reduce it down to 10 minutes, is just Ash is just going to share with you what is our plan with the digital inclusion blueprint, and then I'll just spend a bit of time, which is important, around the approach that we're looking to actually help create a digitally inclusive state, and also then do the promotion around. We've developed some consultation materials. We're in the business of consulting now, and just talk you through how you can help us extend the reach to your clients and communities, so we can ensure that we can hear as many voices as we can in forming up what is going to be the government's digital inclusion blueprint. So I'll hand over for Ash to talk through the blueprint and benefits that we see.
Thanks, John. So digital inclusion is one of our office's 6 digital transformation priorities. And those are the government's commitments. So in that, we committed to improving digital inclusion. And so our office is then responsible for delivering that, and we sit in DPC. So the way that we're proposing to deliver that is by this draft blueprint, which is what we're currently consulting on. And then afterwards, we'll also have some key initiatives, which we've already kind of started to develop at an early stage. Particularly during COVID-19. So our hope is that through the blueprint, we'll be delivering a collaborative approach with community organisations and with industry. So I'll just now take you through the blueprint a little bit. Obviously, Alan and Chris have touched on the wider issue of digital inclusion. And Alan, you did a really good job, so thank you. But obviously, digital inclusion is a growing issue. And in WA in particular, we have a lot of remote communities where they don't have familiarity with digital technology and the internet, given the limited infrastructure and support for skills. So that's sort of the context in which we're dealing with. So this infographic kind of succinctly and quite simply explains our approach to digital inclusion. So it's that collaborative partnership approach, which John will talk about, but our vision is really to make sure that everyone can enjoy the benefits of technology and the internet in their everyday lives. So we want to bring it down to the individual and what actually helps them in their everyday life. Our approach will really be to make sure that we're helping to deliver community-based solutions. So really using those in the community to work to legitimate relevant solutions. We've picked for strategic priorities. So Alan talked a little bit about access, but we've sort of broken that down into connectivity, design, skills, and affordability. So it's really simple. Connectivity for us is more about the infrastructure that supports the person getting access to the internet and digital technology. Design is more about our services. So how government designs their digital services, as well as digital services more widely in general, and technology. So seeing how we can influence that to be more accessible for people who may have a disability, or just to make it more easier for everyone else. And skills, so making sure people are ready to navigate the internet and do research and everything. And affordability is also another part of that as well. So making sure technology and the internet is more affordable, particularly for remote and regional communities in WA. So we've sort of come up with a brief list of proposed initiatives that may be relevant, but of course we're also looking at ones that are more smaller scale for local communities, which we'd be really working with not-for-profits in those communities to develop and deliver. But so the infographic sort of gives an overview. We've started by piloting a repurposing initiative with a Peak Youth Not-for-Profit at the moment. Some other things we're also looking at, so we'll look for the feedback from consultation to work on those. And the benefits are also expressed in the infographic. So I'll pass it to John as well to talk a bit more about our partnership approach, because that really requires community organisations to be working with government, and obviously for government to reciprocate in turn and do the same.
Okay, thanks, Ash. We really understand, and what I really want to talk about is just spend a few minutes about the approach that we're proposing. We understand that no one can do this, can deliver digital inclusion by themselves. It really is going to require communities, the community sector, all tiers of government and industry to really work together to ensure that all members of the community can access and use digital technologies. So that's a pretty big ask in terms of trying to get that all happening. So what we've described in the blueprint is that we've got different roles to play. And certainly with the Office of Digital Government, with our ministerial mandate, is we've got a really great opportunity and capacity to do a coordination role. So it's around, we want to take that role and actually work with our community service agencies and organisations in really understanding what are the initiatives and solutions to help that will help build this digital inclusivity across our state. We see the community sector agencies and organisations, they're best placed, they're out there in the community so they can understand firsthand and work to really understand what are the problems and co-design these solutions to really affect the change. But, we fully understand that there's no one solution for all communities and groups. So it's going to be interesting and challenging in creating what I personally call is this digital inclusive ecosystem. We've got so many moving parts, and part of it is around the relationships and building understanding of what the capacity is that we can each deliver and contribute to the cause. And I'll share with you one example from our consultations. When we talk to telcos, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of organisations out there who actually want to come in and help communities build capacity with cybersecurity. But we've got a depth and such a wide state to do it. But on the government side, we've got a library network and a regional commissions, that we have an infrastructure in terms of capacity to be able to deliver that sort of training. So a true partnership would actually be working together and understanding with the communities, working with the communities, how best can we deliver this sort of information and training so we don't feel like we all have to duplicate the deployment as well as the skills building capability. And in that regard, when we've been speaking to ACWA, they're also saying, look, don't do things to us, do it with us. And what we're hearing is build the capacity of our young youth who can go out and work with community members where English is not a first or second language, it can be a third language. But not only are we helping to build our own community capacity by skilling up community members, it's actually they can deliver the services on the front line. So, I mean, they're just snapshots of some of the conversations that we're hearing. We are listening, and that's what we're trying to do in this consultation phase. What we started off on, embarked on this journey, is what could be a document with priority initiatives is really going to take some real thoughtful considerations, because we really are just beginning the dialogue. And with our team members and with Tina, as we outreach further, you know, digital inclusion is something that we don't want to do to the community, we want to do with the community. And so that's going to help really inform what some of our early initiatives are. And on that note, my plug now, this is where I'm seeking your enrolment is we've developed, oh, sorry, Ash, you're right, I haven't been flicking through. We've developed a whole set of materials. We're consulting at the moment on the 16th of October. We're going to have a community, and I'm sure Kylie's going to do a plug for us at the end. We've got a community sector organisation. We want to pull them in for a workshop to get some really good understanding of the lived experiences and some of the solutions that can help address some digital inclusion, because we have been asked to put what could be some priority initiatives as part of the blueprint up to government for consideration. We're looking to host a similar event with industry, because we see that they're a vital party. So we're going to say, this is what we're hearing from the community sector. What are you guys in industry doing, and how can we collaboratively work together? And building it is really key, is understanding the relationships. And to inform all of this work, we need two pieces of feedback. The first is around our approach, which is in the blueprint. We fully anticipate this will be a different document. What we've published at the moment is more a discussion paper that puts the thinking and logic, but the blueprint will be a more targeted document that speaks to community around how we see digital inclusion can be built, and more importantly, the approach and our commitment to building this approach. The second piece of feedback we're looking for is the lived experiences. We really want to understand through outreach, through using community sector organisations and community leads, what is it that are the issues of your lived experience of digital inclusion? Because it's that data and information that can inform the insights for what could be some initiatives that can help build this digital inclusion. So to help you, we have a consultation guide. It explains all the tools, all the surveys and the resource materials we have available should you be communicating with your community organisations and community. It's hopefully a very simple guide just to say how you can use these tools to gather people's feedback into the consultation process. We'd really appreciate that support, because the more voices we hear, the better it is. To date, we've already got over 400. So it's attracting a lot of interest. And if you can keep building it, wow, that's a great outcome. We're already trying to find resources to support the analysis. So, you know, it's extended what we thought we'd get feedback on, but we're doing that. And we're really keen to hear what happens. So with that, I'll hand you back to Kylie for the consultation. Oh, questions or the focus questions.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ashley. We've got one question in the chat. Ashley's wondering, in addition to the community services sector, what specific plans you've got for engaging with local governments?
So we have a digital inclusion working group from which agencies all over the public sector sit on. We have the Department of Local Government and state libraries, and they're really reaching out to their local government authorities as well as the local libraries to get them all on board, to make sure that not only are they all providing their feedback, but also that they're promoting feedback at their local government institutions like your libraries, where people are really actually getting support, digital inclusion support anyway, and they have printouts and everything there. So we're not only just engaging people in that community, but also local government authorities and everything have provided feedback. So we've gotten feedback from some of those local areas as well. And then Tina's also helping us with more of our regional and remote communities as well. So that's how we're doing.
Great, thanks Ashley. And Stuart's got a question about affordability.
Yeah, I just read it and I'll answer it. There's a national body called the Australian Data and Digital Council, forgetting the fluff, but it's all around ministers responsible for digital transformation across the nation meet with the Federal Minister, Robert. They publish communiques, and if you, probably people aren't scanning for this sort of stuff, but the issue of affordability, one of the immediate initiatives that certainly Northern Territory and WA are co-leading on is actually trying to get an understanding of the impact, particularly with prepaid mobile data plans, where individuals who are trying to access government services, if they wait on a line for too long, their data's gone. So there is a negotiation around some zero cost service, particularly for government service delivery. We're at a feasibility study at the moment. Northern Territory is actually collecting every jurisdictional data traffic to government websites and phone calls, just to get a sense of how big of an issue this is. And they are working to take something forward around options for all jurisdictions to make some consideration on. So, Stuart, that's a great question. It won't address all issues, but with that initiative, put in what the Department of Communities and that relationship that we've got with YACWA in terms of repurposing government ICT equipment, which basically means let's get rid of old equipment that's highly functional, repurposed for community use. We're helping to address this affordability in a couple of areas. So there's that feasibility, and YACWA already calling for youth who would potentially be participants in that program, sign up, because there's a free equipment to go, there's some free data to go with it. And what we want to do, DGov's involved because we want to evaluate it, and if this turns out to be an initiative that goes a long way to help disadvantaged youth, what about other parts of the community? And why just repurpose government equipment if we could repurpose community equipment?
And industries equipment.
Yeah, and industries as well.
And our partnerships with industry groups and telecommunication companies will really assist with that, which is something else that we want to do at our industry forum as well. So, but any ideas and feedback from the community though is always really helpful during this process as well.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks, Stuart, for the question. Are there any other questions at all for Alan or for John and Ashley? Jenny.
Yeah, hi. Look, mine might be a naive question, but I wondered, just building on that last response from you, John, if more widespread Wi-Fi, you know, in public places was something that the government was considering.
Yeah, it's another one of those initiatives.
That's on our infographic that I showed earlier. But yeah, it's something that we're exploring, but it also really helps to get that feedback from the community and from organisations who know that my clients would greatly benefit from receiving that sort of support, you know, in the CBD or in their local area, in this sort of area or something around.
Yeah, okay. So the reason I mentioned it is that WACOS run an online directory called WA Connect, which you may or may not be familiar with. And we do get some Google Analytics from that platform. And we do find that a lot of people are accessing that platform from places where there's free Wi-Fi. So, you know, people who we know because of what they're searching for are probably on a low income, but also therefore reliant on Wi-Fi in public places, including Centrelink and hospitals.
And McDonald's.
And McDonald's, thanks, Stuart, yes.
And that is a great question, because I know the question has been asked to some government agencies who are located in regional and remote areas who have the connectivity. What does it take to extend that to the community? And it's just a question, but there's a lot of interest in this area, and I think they're fantastic questions on which people can begin to propose solutions and actually understand what is the implementation and is it that high cost.
Just to add to what John's saying as well, there have been some early pilot initiatives where our Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development have gone into Aboriginal and remote communities to make sure that they work with the community to sort of develop some of those local ecosystems so that they deliver those sort of hubs but then they also provide the support as well to make sure that there's no risk in the skill gap and awareness about, you know, digital scans, online scans and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's that real co-design piece. You know, you need to work with the community to understand digital literacy and so forth, because you don't want to be actually putting a tool, you said it beautifully, Chris, you don't want to put tools into people's hands which may be misused, which can be simply addressed through building capacity within the community as well, who can actually teach community members how to do it or what to be aware of. So there's, you know, there's great dialogue going on, and it's going to make it for a much richer blueprint and for us to propose some ideas to government based on what we're hearing.
That's great. Thanks, Jenny, for the question. Are there any other questions? Any other final questions? I'm almost at a point of, do we still break out into rooms given we're almost at time? Any other questions at all? What I might do, because we often lose people when we go into breakout rooms, is just ask a couple of the questions that we have prepared for them and see if anyone's got any responses just here in the larger room. So I suppose we're curious to know, given John mentioned the workshop, looking to hold that on the 16th of October, and we're really going to be practically focused there on initiatives that would actually support the clients and communities that we're all working with. So does anyone have any ideas about digital inclusion initiatives that would support their clients and communities, and or have you already seen some in action that you think would be useful to learn from? Nothing.
I suppose I can add something. I'm just thinking about like the experience in working with one of the regional communities that I work with, in which they had problems where they couldn't, young people couldn't access the internet and couldn't access like phone charging and things like that. And so some of those young people were putting themselves in vulnerable situations to get access to internet. Like that's how critical it was for those young people. And so they moved access to like a public place, which I think removed people from those vulnerable spaces, but that it had the added impact that then kids weren't going home because they knew that they could publicly access, like the houses didn't have Wi-Fi, and so then kids were going home, staying out so that they could use the public Wi-Fi. So I guess it's just reiterating how important community co-design is, because it was more complex and it has to be a continual process.
Yeah, Sophie, that's a great reflective comment, and that's what we really are learning. And I think what we're learning through this consultation is we can help create the ecosystem, but the ecosystem requires, you know, people like yourselves to be, you've got the contacts with the community members to actually really help pivot and make sure initiatives are meeting the purpose, because not all initiatives may work in all areas. And when I'm not going to assume that for a moment. I think if we can build this ecosystem, for lack of better words, I know, because it's so IT-ish, but if we have these an ecosystem and people are understanding the plays in the different areas and who has made a commitment to participate and support, that's a really good working place for the community sector and government community agencies to actually take that forward. So that's a great comment. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks, Sophie. And Alex has noted also that the 100 Families WA research project, and we'll have some information coming from their engagement with 400 families around digital needs and ideas. So I'm sure that's a useful piece of research that we can support to feed into. So thank you, Alex.
I was going to add, Kylie, to that, so we've learned out of the COVID situation where in terms of homeschool, and these are Perth-based families, so 158 we surveyed about their impact around COVID-19, so all families living in hardship. It was really two sides of the coin situation. So for those families who had kids, for example, who had access to all the resources and had digital literacy, they had a great experience. Like their experience was fine and they were comfortable to do that at home. The flip side of that is all those families who didn't have the resources or the understanding of how to, you know, use those resources. some of those were mitigated by the coronavirus supplement. So during that first payout, they went and bought a computer so the 4 kids at home could use that for homeschooling. But around 25% of the 158 still had a negative experience. And then a bit further on in terms of this is across the services, because most of the services then went online to try and reach families. It was again a two-sided thing. We found that really helpful because they didn't have to leave the house, you know, they could look after their kids and still engage their worker. But the other half, again, didn't have that luxury. But the qualitative part, because that's all quantitative, is coming out in the next, well, hopefully a few months, but there certainly will be a release in November that hopefully speaks to this. So I'm happy to engage you more and send that to you to give some of the stories behind those stats.
That would be awesome, because what we're trying to create with the blueprint is, has the draft blueprint now probably seems academic if I'd use a word. What we want to do is actually have a document that speaks to people that we're trying to work with. And the most illustrative ways, the more stories that we build in, helps tell the story of what we're trying to achieve and deliver. So that factual information would be awesome if we can help contribute that to a final. What we want it to be is a simple document, but more built around lived experiences. That would be awesome stuff. We'd greatly appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Chris.
Yeah, John, I've sort of had a bit of a question and a comment. So we've been talking a lot about the effort and resources the government is in putting access to public and transactional services online. I guess one of the concerns that we've got, you know, going back to you talking about it being a digital ecosystem, what we know about ecosystem resilience and productivity is the more diverse they are, the more productive they are. Our real risk at the moment is that while on the one hand, we know that the local embedded face-to-face services are often the most responsive, but when it comes to having the capacity to actually build online services or even just online portals to link up and get access to face-to-face services, the real risk is that the smaller and the local organisations won't have the capacity and will actually lose a lot of that diversity, and it'll only be the bigger players who are able to go online to deliver services. Or what we will see is that we've got several people all developing different products to do the same thing. So I'm wondering, what's the capacity there for us to take a, you know, like coordinated approach to how we build some of those kind of online tools and systems for whether it's just simply getting access to services or actually the delivery of those services. You know, a lot of the tools that we may want and already be developing for public health services are very much the same tools we'll want to use for mental health, or we'll want to use for family and relationship counselling, or whatever else. And there's a whole pile of services that we don't necessarily want to go online. But for the ones that we are, how do we make sure we, you know, maintain that diversity and access?
Chris, it's an awesome question, and perhaps it can be taken on notice, but I'll give you 2 reflective comments to help build the understanding, because we don't have all the solutions. The first is on a related piece, we are revisiting the whole digital strategy that the state has. So digital inclusion is one of them, and this is an early initiative. So the 2 pieces of work are happening concurrently. The digital strategy will be around improving service delivery to the community, and it'll be enabled by technology. But a key cornerstone will be that it's digital, but not digital only. And that's certainly the drivers that what we've been having. We don't want to confuse this with digital first and all those other vernacular that assumed that we're moving into a digital only world. We're in fact quite clear with our messaging around that. We do want to make it digitally enabled, but it's not going to be digital only. And that it's certainly in our draft versions, that's the language that we're certainly using, because we recognize that. So that's my first reflective glance on your question. Your second one is a real rich one, and it comes down to a cultural issue around government and service delivery design. And what we're finding, what we're moving towards is people use, you may have heard, it's the life event approach, that you actually start with the citizen at the centre and track their journeys as they navigate for critical life events. Death of a loved one. We've done some work just on the death of a loved one. And what we've discovered so far, there's at least 34, probably 85 when you put in some private sector telco issues, that when somebody deals with that death of a loved one, we've got all these issues to do. We haven't got the next of kin. Oh my God, I can't cancel this off. My mother's still getting these bills under my father's names, and just all these tragic things. And then we've got in the community, in some of our communities, where name and where people have become deceased, we've got to work through those and be sensitive to, actually, a life event is not always, the death of a loved one is experienced culturally differently. But that takes a level of maturity and capability. And we are looking in our strategies to build that capability and strategy so we can make service delivery more appropriate. But it is placing the citizen at the heart of it. It's understanding our segments. And and I fully agree. It really takes that collaborative approach. And I'll tell you what, we're learning how to engage with the community more effectively just through this project. So it's not around just putting something out and saying I've collaborated. It's actually fostering and building the understanding, the relationships, and actually taking a critical eye and listening to those lived experiences or life events as people experience them.
And John, just to add to that, South Australia is developing an accessibility toolkit, which we also engage with them on the Australian Data and Digital Inclusion working group. They're promoting that as more of a thing that other jurisdictions can leverage. That toolkit is not just for government services. I think it's also about trying to promote accessibility in digital services for smaller organisations, so that we're more influencing how digital services are designed and delivered. So that's another aspect as well to explore.
That's great. Thank you so much for everyone's questions, and to John and Ashley for your responses to them. I'll draw us to a close there just because we've just passed 2 o'clock. So please do keep a lookout for the workshop information. So we'll make that available to you when we send the slides out from the presentation today. There is a capacity of 40. So please do make sure you register pretty quickly. Thanks again for your engagement today. And thank you so much to our presenters, to Alan, to John, and to Ashley, and to Chris. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. So thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the day.